Hello, I'm John, and this is Must Read More. Today I'm going to talk about Sarah Bradford's The Reluctant King, The Life and Reign of George VI. So, I really enjoyed this book, but I don't think it would be for everyone, clearly. Um, so, George VI was the brother of Edward VIII. They were the children of George V and Queen Mary. And he was the grandson of Edward VII, the great-grandson of Victoria, Queen Victoria. And George was what we refer to now as the spare. He was never supposed to be king. His brother Edward was supposed to be. I'm just going to call him George and Edward, because if I get into titles and things, it'll just it's already kind of complicated reading this book because there are so many different titles. They had a pretty bad upbringing. You would think that being the sons of a king that they would have it easy and they would have a pleasant upbringing, but that was far from the truth. Their parents really didn't care for them, or they didn't show that they cared for them, at least, really. Particularly not their father, who was kind of almost a bully in a way. He definitely didn't have any tolerance for their weakness at all, not when they were young, not when they were older. They had a nanny that mistreated them for something like 3 years, and their parents didn't notice at all. It took them 3 years to figure it out. They grew up in pretty small rooms in York Cottage, which I believe is on the grounds of Sandringham. I may be wrong about that. And they were kept completely apart from other kids their own age. It was just them and their other brothers and their sister. And they were educated by a tutor and some of his assistants, and George never really knew what it was like to be around other people his own age until he went to he was forced to go to the Naval Academy, and it really didn't work out too well for him at the Naval Academy. He was mistreated there, not so much by the people who ran the place, but by the other kids. George, who was Prince Albert at that time, was picked on. I guess that the other kids saw, he was kind of frail. He'd had illnesses his whole life. He had problems with his legs. He had to wear these really painful braces for several years. He didn't really do very well as far as grades went. He wasn't an intellectual at all. Not many of the royals were intellectuals, and probably not many of them have been intellectuals through history. Edward went into the army, I believe. George went into the Navy, and they both served during World War I, which George was on HMS Collingwood, which he actually did see combat at the Battle of Jutland, which I forget the particulars, but a really spectacular account of the Battle of Jutland is in Robert K. Massey's Castles of Steel. It's just spectacular. That whole book is really good. But anyway, so all during this time, World War One, he was sick. He had like an ulcer. Of course, he also had a very bad stammer, which kind of sprang from his childhood, from being mistreated by his nanny and being bullied by his father, being ignored by his mother, or being ignored by both of them, really. They seem to have cared a lot about their kids, but neither one of them had a means of showing that they cared or of demonstrating that they cared. They were very much of the Victorian idea that children should be seen but not heard, and they should only be seen on certain occasions. And as you can imagine, that caused a lot of problems in kids of that generation, and in George and Edward and their brothers and sister. So after Jutland, after some illnesses, he transferred out of the Navy into the RAF, into a very early form of the RAF, and he learned how to pilot an airplane. They wouldn't let him fly alone because he was royal. He was still important in the line of succession, so if something happened to him, it was a very big deal, and airplanes were very in their infancy at that point. So after that, he went into private life. Basically, he thought that he would have a pretty quiet life. He had royal duties, mostly that took him to factories and that kind of thing. And he would have to give speeches at the opening of factories or talk to unions, I guess, which it was very hard for him because he had a lot of anxiety about crowds, and he had a terrible stammer, which he was embarrassed by, and it made for very difficult listening to it for anyone in the crowd. It was just really, really difficult for him. But he thought that he could live a pretty quiet life. He was married to Elizabeth, who would become Elizabeth the Queen Mother, Queen Elizabeth the Queen Mother. And everything was going along pretty well for him until the death of George V, whereon Edward VIII was supposed to take charge, but he failed spectacularly. Edward VIII was a very vain, selfish, arrogant, somewhat delusional man who became enamored, completely infatuated with Wallis Simpson, who was an American socialite who had 2 husbands already, both of whom were still alive. So she was a divorcee, which was a very big deal in the 30s, particularly for someone who was aiming to marry the King of England, the defender of the faith. And people were very, very unhappy about this because at the time, while he was Prince of Wales and while he was Edward VIII, Wallis Simpson was married. So they saw pictures of their king hand in hand, arm in arm, with a married woman, which, as you can imagine, was a pretty big scandal. And Parliament was not okay with Edward marrying Wallis Simpson, and because the King of England is a constitutional monarch and is subject to Parliament, the rules of Parliament, whatever. Anyway, That's pretty complicated stuff. And Edward's family was horrified by Wallace Simpson. They were horrified by the affair. They were horrified by this basically that Edward was getting Wallace Simpson to divorce her husband so that he could marry her and that she could become the Queen of England. And they were just completely horrified by this. This was a much different time than our own. People, even the royals, were pretty religious people. Edward was not religious in the slightest. And they didn't like Wallace Simpson. And I think there's pretty good reason for that. It's because at the heart of all this, Wallace Simpson seems to have been very much like Edward VIII. She was kind of empty-headed and vain and greedy and just completely focused on social climbing. And I think that, you know, his family saw through her, saw through to who she was, whereas he was just infatuated, just completely taken by Wallace Simpson. And you know, even into the later on, for the rest of his life, people would comment on just how infatuated Edward was with Wallace Simpson. And she treated him really poorly, actually. But it came to a crisis. Parliament would not allow Edward to marry Wallace Simpson. They certainly wouldn't have allowed her to have been made queen. And it was forced to a head so that Edward VIII chose to abdicate. And that put George on the throne, which absolutely horrified him. He was terrified. He was anguished by Edward's decision, and he was anguished by this massive responsibility that fell right on his head that he did not want at all. And he kind of held that against Edward for the rest of their lives, well, for the rest of his life. Edward seems to have had this idea that he was so popular with the people that he could abdicate and yet still basically remain King of England and just let George do all the grunt work. Let George go out and do all the ceremonies. Let George go out and give the speeches. Me, I'll just hang out and party. We'll just have our empty-headed parties, and we'll drink a lot, and we'll hang out with all these socialites, and people will still know that I'm the real king. That seems to me to have been Edward VIII's basic idea of what abdication meant. And so, of course, in 1939, the war started. World War II started in Europe. And George VI was, of course, front and center. And it was just an incredible strain because now not only was he king, but he had to serve as this symbol of stability along with his wife. He would have to go out and, or he chose to stay in London during the Blitz. He chose to go out and survey damage from the bombs. He chose to go out and meet with the people, and he became incredibly popular and just beloved, really. And more than that, he seems to have really inspired hope and friendship in the people who came close to him. To Winston Churchill, for instance, who seems to have really, really been taken with George, even though George had a problem with Winston, because Winston had supported Edward VIII during the Abdication crisis and had supported his marriage to Wallace Simpson and to her becoming queen, really, even though later on he realized that would have been a mistake and that really it was a good thing that George became king. And it's just really an interesting look into this man's life, at how he even though he was completely opposite in nature to what a king requires, and he saw he had all this trouble with being king, with going out and giving speeches, meeting people and doing these reviews and all this kind of thing. He took it very, very seriously. He was very well versed in everything that was going on during the war, and he really lived up to what a king ought to be for his people. I think that's very admirable. I think his story is very admirable. He died in 1952 he had arteriosclerosis, and he had a tumor in his lung. One of his lungs had to be removed, and he was doing okay, but he got a blood clot one night and died in his sleep. And people were really, really sad to see him go. And of course, his death ushered in the reign of Elizabeth II. And I think that George's legacy lived on in Elizabeth II. I think he was and would have been very proud of her. And yeah, so that's George VI. I've left out a whole lot, but it's a very inspiring story. I find it very inspiring because I myself have dealt with anxiety for most of my life. I don't like crowds. I don't like speeches. Doing these videos scares me, to be honest. And I have some of his bad traits either. Also, I could have a temper. I could be kind of petty. But now the book itself is told in kind of a non-linear fashion, where, for instance, Sarah Bradford goes on about World War II for a couple of chapters, but then she leaps back to 1935, and she really expects you to know who all these figures are. She expects you to know the acronyms and all the titles, and to have knowledge of what was going on in that period of time. So I don't really think that this book is very approachable for just a casual reader, for someone who's not pretty familiar with the 20s, 30s, and 40s. She does give some pretty good background information on Victoria and Edward VII. It's a little dry. It's not dramatic like, well, for instance, Robert K. Massey's books. But if you're into this kind of thing, if George interests you, then you'll probably like this book. If you're into royal biographies, you might enjoy this one. That's all I have today. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.